Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please go to avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am happy to be joined by a friend and author and philosopher, Christopher Kaczor. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Michael. Thank you for having me on.
So I have you on the show today so we can talk. You've already been on the show before to talk about your book on Jordan Peterson and the Bible with Word on Fire Press. And today we have another one of your new books is Believable? Reasoning about God from Plato and Aquinas to C.S. Lewis and Jordan Peterson. And this one is with Ave Maria Press. So glad to have you continuing to write all these books. And thanks for all you do.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it's great to be able to talk to you again. And I think last time we were in person, so this is remote, but it's good to reconnect.
Yes, and it was great. We were chatting as well. I met you in graduate school about 30 years ago this spring.
That's
So it's
right.
been wonderful to see all just the great work you've continued to do. And for those who may not know, you are the honorary professor of the Renewal of Catholic Life with the Word on Fire Institute, as well as a professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University out in California. And also, for this year, you are the president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association. So that's quite an honor, and congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it is quite an honor. I was really delighted to be elected to this. And as you may know, Bishop Fulton Sheen was once president of this association, and it's in its 100th year this year. So we're having a huge celebration to recognize the founding of our association in 1926. In November of 2026, we'll have a 100-year celebration. So yeah, I'm very excited about that. And it's an honor and a privilege to be able to continue this great group, the American Catholic Philosophical Association.
Yeah. So, what did you said you were going to dedicate it to a living tradition?
That's right. Yeah, we're having a conference, and the title of it is Living Tradition. And part of the conference is to think about our mentors and those that have nurtured us, and to think about what we've learned from them and how we ourselves can contribute to continuing this tradition that they've handed on to us. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. The call for papers is out already, and we'll see. We'll collect the papers and hopefully have a great conference.
That's excellent, and it is a real, it's kind of a testament because there are a lot of organizations, right, that have been around for a while, but one that has from 1926 to 2026 means it also survived 1976 and the 70s. And
Right.
right, the 70s were not always they were rough times for Catholic theology and philosophy. And the fact that a kind of an ardent Thomist and defender of the Catholic philosophical and theological tradition would be elected as president is not only a testament to your professional scholarly achievements and credentials, but also to the fact that I think the ACPA has really kind of somehow navigated the last 100 years, still trying to operate within the kind of the faithful tradition of Catholic philosophy.
I think that's right, and philosophy, I think, on average, has had a better time through the '70s and '80s. A number of, Catholic universities, the theology departments more or less went off on their own direction, and over time became something like religious studies, departments. But in philosophy, there was, to a greater degree, a willingness and ability to hang on to important parts of the Catholic intellectual tradition. I think in particular about places like Catholic U, where in the '70s and '80s it had Charlie Kern and they were really going crazy. But the School of Philosophy at Catholic University of America was actually, faithful through that whole period. So, no, I am very grateful that the American Catholic Philosophical Association still exists. There actually was, probably in the '70s, a push to get rid of the word Catholic in the name of the group, but that was actually, defeated, and so now I feel like the association is really on very footing and really moving forward into very hopeful and firm territory. So I'm very excited about that.
So your new book is Believable. This is a very accessible book that I was really enjoyed reading, and a lot of the I think you have somewhere in the order of like 36 chapters. A lot of the chapters are about maybe 3 to 5 pages, 4 to 5 pages long, but you really pack a lot of kind of philosophical density and theological insight into these arguments. What inspired you to write this book?
Oh, well, thank you for the kind words about it. I appreciate that. So the book's inspiration is really out of my teaching. So I teach a course here at Loyola Marymount called The God of Faith and Reason. And one of the challenges and opportunities at LMU is that the classroom really has a huge ideological diversity. So if I'm teaching 28 students, I'll very often have, two or three students that are very serious Catholics. They're, go to mass regularly, say the rosary. I mean, they're very committed. And then I'll have 2 or 3 students, with green hair, they, them pronouns. I mean, totally, opposed to the Catholic intellectual tradition. And then most of the students are somewhere in the middle. So they might be students that are, raised Catholic, but only go to mass at Easter with grandma. And so there's really this ideological diversity. And so I love teaching this course because in the course, what I'm trying to do is show to these students something that all of them, despite their ideological diversity, actually agree about. And what would that be? I think that almost all my students here agree that faith and reason are opposed. And so the students that are the strong Catholic students will say, faith and reason are opposed. I choose faith. And then the blue haired, they, them atheist students say, faith and reason are opposed. Well, I choose reason. And then even the students in the middle basically think the same thing. And so the book is an effort to push back on this sort of supposition that faith and reason are opposed. We have to choose either faith or reason. And so all the essays are aimed at overcoming this sort of division, which I think is very pernicious. The first part of the book is basically to push back on obstacles to belief. So things like materialism, things like scientism, the idea that science and science alone provides the truth. And then in the middle of the book, I'm exploring what Aquinas would call the preambles of faith. So truths about God that we can know through using our reason. So things like there has to be an uncaused cause, there has to be a foundational principle to the all reality, and that there can only be one God, things like that. And then in the final part of the book, I'm trying to push back on obstacles to belief in the mysteries of faith. That is to say, obstacles to belief in revelation. And so there I'm looking at people like Sam Harris that will say things like, well, dogma is essentially deadly to thinking, and we should oppose dogma at every turn. And so I'm pushing back on those sorts of views. So that's sort of the general um, outline of the book. And you're right that chapters are deliberately very short. And part of the goal of that is, I think sometimes people can feel kind of intimidated if they pick up a book and then they see the chapters are 100 pages long, and they think, oh my gosh, I just don't even want to get into this. And so I'm hoping to have a very reader friendly book that has short chapters. You can sit down and just read a chapter or 2 and, go on with your day.
Yeah, and I think you've really succeeded in that. I think this would be, I love the Catholic intellectual tradition, philosophical, theological, and kind of made my home there. Right, for 30 years or more. And yet it's how do you share that and communicate that to people that don't have the either, inclination, willingness, availability to kind of dive into that, but still have the basic, some of the same questions or the same objections or wonder how to respond. And I do really think that your book is one that really addresses those questions in a way that said that's very accessible, and I really appreciate that. I was thinking there's so many different facets here. Is belief believable? This idea that Christianity can be reasonable, even if it is beyond what is known by reason alone. It's not beyond what is known by reason in our history, because reason in our history includes right, the revelation of God to Moses, right, the revelation of God to Isaiah, right, the revelation of God to in Jesus Christ, right. I love the way that you portray that idea that I can know a lot about something by reason, but I can't really know a person until the person opens their mouth, right, and speaks and communicates, and that really is what's going to establish make possible the intimacy of friendship. And so this idea that reason can move to receive the communication of faith, right? Is I think something that's really, as you point out, it's like people somehow think that that's a contradiction, but so many of the great philosophers have shown that it's actually the natural point of our reason. In some ways, what is our reason for? It's not to get to know rocks, right? It's not to get to know math. It's to get to know persons. And that requires that the other person unveil, disclose, speak. So, could you say a little bit about that idea of revelation and the way that revelation opens up this intimate relationship with God?
Yeah, that's part of what I try to do in the course and also in this book is to make the point that you were just making about two different ways of knowing a person. So one way is through from the outside, you might say, in the sense that you can know a lot about a person just by looking at them. So think about, I don't know, LeBron James or something. And you can say, well, I've watched him play basketball and I can tell a lot about who he is just by, watching him on the basketball court. So he's obviously strong. He's obviously good at basketball, he's agile, he has all these characteristics. And yet, there's, uh, in a sense, the most important things about him and about any of us isn't so much what's on the outside, how much we weigh or our blood pressure or our height, but the things on the inside, as it were. So things like, what is it that you care most about? Who is it in your life that you really, really love? What sorts of things make you want to cry? These are the sorts of things, these kind of intimate details about someone's life that are not accessible simply if you look at a medical form or something and you see, wow, this person has, this, blood pressure or something. So the same thing's true about God. So with God, yes, there are certain things we can know about God simply through philosophical investigation. So we can know that there has to be a first cause. And we can know that there has to only be one ultimately first cause. So there's lots of things we can know about God using our reasoning. But the deepest and most important things we know about God are when God speaks, when God reveals himself. And as Christians, we believe that God's most perfect speech about himself is when his eternal word becomes flesh. So it's Jesus himself that is the fullness of divine revelation. But what we know about God through reason and what we know about God through faith are not, at the end of the day, contradictory. So what we know about God through faith does go beyond what we know about God through reasoning, just as what you know about me through my speech can go beyond what you know about me through just knowing medical facts about me or something. These two truths, though, are really ultimately in harmony because God doesn't contradict himself. So, what God teaches about himself through the book of nature and what God teaches about himself through the book of Revelation are not exactly the same. Revelation obviously transcends what we can know just through reason, but also are not contradictory. So, that's one of the fundamental themes that I explore in this book.
So this reminds me, I was recently in a conversation with someone, and he was sharing that he should be going to church more or something like that. Sometimes you
Mhm.
get that when you're a theologian, right? So people say these things,
Yeah.
and so I said kind of like, well, what's the reason? Like, what do you think is the best argument for the truth of the Catholic faith? And he kind of paused a little bit, but he said, well, he just thinks that basically the faith holds people together. It holds together communities. It holds together families. That we need some kind of belief in God, and I think that's really true, right? And I was sharing that in some ways, right? God is above us, so He can hold us together without being competitive. Whereas if we try to form a community by what's below us, say land or money or prestige, we'll inevitably kind of create division. Uh, and I think that's a kind of ordering to something higher. And so I think there's an implicit desire for God as a common, a shared good, right? But one of the things that I was, kind of pausing on trying to think about, like, okay, how to follow up was, trying to get him to there's something about, though, reason gets to a point where it has to admit kind of that not only is there more it can know about God, but that it needs to know. Reason kind of discovers a problem, right? Because if there is something good and loving and holy and wise behind the universe, I also somehow discover that I'm somewhat wise, somewhat good, right? But I'm also not, right? I also discover sin. And so I think reason it on its own at least discovers a bit of a problem that Christianity solves, right? And it's that idea that Christianity is more than just the existence of God, but it's also the idea of the existence of sin, and that I've discovered myself to be somewhat alienated from God, and that God is on a great rescue mission. So, could you say a little bit, just a word before we dive into some of the other arguments of your book about this, just the nature of the gospel, right? This idea that the distinctive theme of Christianity as really trust and faith in God's saving us in Jesus Christ, and something that we could not, right, do or earn on our own.
Right, that's such a great point. I mean, to think of Jesus just as a teacher rather than as not just a teacher, but also savior, I do think is a big mistake. And sometimes people do even reduce Christianity to really just ethics or social justice or, uh, a glue for society to keep us all together. Because I totally agree. If you try to found a unity on any finite divisible good, there's going to be troubles about how to share that good, right? So land is a limited resource and money is a limited resource. So, you can naturally have these squabbles about how to divide those things up. Whereas God has a common good that is not diminished by sharing. I mean, if you love God more, well, that doesn't cause me to have less love of God. God is obviously big enough for to have relationships with both of us. So I do think there's this danger of reducing Christianity, as some people have done, to a kind of program of social justice or a program of societal glue that holds us all together. And what's distinctive about Christianity is that Jesus is a savior, that the sins and the vices uh, that we suffer from have a solution in the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so Christianity isn't, I think, properly understood simply as an ethical or a moral guideline where the point of Jesus is just to tell us about right and wrong. I think C.S. Lewis, I think, was right to think that we actually already know that from, just, natural reasoning. In other words, among philosophers, we can see, ethical guidelines and principles, many of them which are very helpful. And I think when people try to live those out, I think pretty quickly they can see, well, that they fail in this way or in that way. And so we don't really need someone to teach us about fundamental right and wrong. In other words, I think everyone who's using their reasoning properly can understand, murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, bearing false witness against your neighbor is wrong. The real trouble is, saving us when we do wrong. And what we need really isn't just the guideline, but we need grace. And that is fundamental, obviously, to Christianity.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put, and it is always good just to step back and remember how much that has changed our view of the world, right? That philosophy on its own, in a way, all might it might often kind of become skeptical over time, right? The Platonists over time become the skeptical, the members of the academy later become the bearers of skepticism. So many people who study philosophy today become skeptical that when human reason on its own tries to bear the weight of discovering truth, it just often or just tries to bear the weight of living a moral life, right? It often kind of despairs. And it's really the good news of Christianity that kind of keeps these things alive. It's like, do you want to see where the main Aristotelians and Platonists today, right? In a way, they're often Christians, right? They're often in Catholic schools and traditions of intellectual life that kind of sustain our hope because we realize, oh, the good that we see is actually achievable and has been achieved in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I would agree that philosophy can and often does go wrong, and that's true in the ancient world and in the modern world too. I mean, if you look at the schools of philosophy in the ancient world, I mean, skepticism was one of those schools. I mean, Augustine, as you know, talks about this in the Confessions, his encounters with all these different schools of thought. And in a way, today we have a similar diversity of different philosophical schools of thought. And there definitely are some schools of thought that are opposed to skepticism. And it kind of depends on what area of knowledge you're talking about. So, for instance, in a moral philosophy, most professional philosophers aren't skeptics about the reality of moral truth. They do think that there is such a thing as truth in ethics, and ethics is not merely a matter of one's emotions or whatever. Now, of course, there are some who disagree with that. But I think Aquinas was right that philosophy can, in principle, discover many things, many truths, but philosophy often does and has in the past and still does go astray. Therefore, faith is very much a boon and a help for the philosopher. And so I think he was really onto something when he discovered that.
Yeah. So Aquinas, in his question, "Does God exist?" in the Summa Theologiae, it's interesting. He usually gives three objections, but on the "Does God exist?" he only lists two. Right. And yet the two he lists are basically the two that are the perennial ones and kind of the two that come to mind most often today, right? One, if God exists, why is there evil? And secondly, if we can analyze secondary causes, why do we need a first cause? So you could kind of summarize that as science, although he also is considering the free will. But basically, it's kind of science and evil are the two big objections that in some ways Aquinas looks at. And I think your book does a great job of addressing both of those. And so I'll kind of leave it to the guest, which one you want to tackle first. But what would you like to say about the way in which we see those arguments or those objections, and how can we use the intellectual tradition to think more clearly about them and recognize they ironically become evidence for God's existence?
There are a number of reasons why people are skeptical of God's existence. And one of the most common, I'd say, in our culture is the idea that science alone provides the truth. And so you have many people who would say, look, I believe in science. And so, that's why I don't know, take the measures I do to help myself become more healthy. I go to the doctor and I get, a prescription for whatever asthma or whatever I have and take these medications to become more healthy. And I fly in planes, and planes are designed, obviously, using advanced technology that presupposes science. And so you say, look, I trust in science. And so don't talk to me about, about God. And then this is often coupled with an idea of God that's a little bit like maybe a second grader might have, that God is understood as sort of a old guy with a long white beard that's somehow hiding behind the moon or something, and say, "Look, I'm a realistic person. I believe in technology. I don't believe in old men hiding behind the moon with a long beard." And when you put these together, a kind of childish understanding of God with a faith in science and technology, this generates in a lot of people a kind of skeptical attitude towards God. But I think both of those things are really mistaken. So, first with science, I am no skeptic of science in the sense of I do believe that science teaches us all kinds of vitally important things about the world. And I do think that science, including technology, has enabled us to live healthier lives and enable us to do all kinds of things. So I'm not denying that. But I think actually that what I am denying is the kind of epistemological claim that the only truths that we can know about are truths that are established by science. The idea that science and science alone provides the truth. And this is sometimes called scientism. In scientism, this idea that the only things that we should believe in are things that science proves. This is itself a view that science doesn't prove. So, this is an example of a self defeating statement, right? It's not true that science and science alone provides the truth. This is not something that science shows. Like I ask my students, okay, science and science alone provides the truth. Is this claim discovered in biology? right? Like you're dissecting a frog and you look behind the liver and out comes a banner. Science alone provides the truth. They laugh. Of course, there's not, that isn't shown there. I said, what about in chemistry, right? Like you got the Bunsen burner out there and you're mixing up two chemicals and a cloud comes out. Science alone provides the truth. Well, no, that doesn't happen in chemistry. Does it happen in physics? No, it's not a truth you discover in physics. So if you look at all the different branches of science, there is no, and I asked the people that are studying science as their major, in any of your classes, has this been one of the scientifically proved things? No. So this is a self-defeating statement. If you really believed only what science shows, then you should not believe the principle that science and science alone provides the truth. And in fact, science presupposes many truths. One of the most important truths that science presupposes is the truths of uh, mathematics. In other words, all scientific investigation presupposes the truth of mathematics. Think about, say, in physics, you have Newton's formula that force equals mass times acceleration. Well, that formula presupposes the truths of multiplication, and so science presupposes math. And math, in an interesting way, I think, pushes back on the idea of materialism, right? The idea that all that exists is matter and matter alone. Because mathematical realities are not material realities, right? If you say of the mathematical reality 2 plus 2 equals 4, well, what is that composed of? What kind of atoms? Is it, how long is it? How much does it weigh? Well, those questions don't make sense. Yes, it's a reality that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but none of those are material realities. So the bottom line is, I think that when we think about science more carefully, we get to the reality that there are some realities that go beyond matter, like mathematical realities. And I think ultimately that mathematical realities point to the reality of God. Now, how does that work? Well, St. Augustine talked about this, that mathematical realities are realities that don't exist in matter, but do exist in minds. So, in your mind and in my mind as well, we both hold in our minds the mathematical reality that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, if we were to die and our minds go out of existence, if all human beings were going to go out of existence, there were no brains around to think about the reality that 2 plus 2 equals 4, it still would be a reality. So if that reality is not in any matter, it's not composed of molecules, but that reality does exist in the mind, well, it can't depend on any human mind. And so what mind would it depend on? Well, the reality that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a reality that is everlasting. So it must exist in an everlasting mind. And not just that reality that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but all mathematical truths. And there's really an infinite number of those, right? 2 plus 2, 3 plus 3, 4 plus 4, and then an infinite number of truths of subtraction and division and multiplication. And these infinite truths exist, Augustine said, in an infinite mind, and we call that infinite mind God. So I think in an interesting way, if we accept the reality of science, that actually leads us step by step to the reality of God.
And Pope Benedict actually makes a similar argument in the Regensburg address that he gave in 2006, where he kind of makes that argument that you point out there, that our contemporary obsession with science, right, really presupposes these immaterial realities, and I love the simple way you do it, right? Just kind of like, well, what are you counting in biology, right? What are you equating in chemistry? What are the equations you're using in physics? We're measuring things and then we're applying mathematical principles to them, right? And I know, at least I was an engineering student as an atheist, and then came back to the faith. But right there is that kind of fundamental, just intuitive sense that's been really shaped by our tradition, which is the world is intelligible,
Hmm.
and that intelligibility of the world doesn't come from dirt. So it comes from our mind. I mean, it comes, our minds recognize it, but our minds don't create it. So it has to come from a higher mind.
Yeah, and I think it's no accident that the scientific revolution of the 17th century arose in a culture that it was a widespread belief that the universe was orderly. So if we go back to the book of Genesis, right, we have God creating. And God creates not through violence, not through a big fight with some other gods, as has happened in many other ancient myths of creation. Rather, God creates through speech, right? God says, "Let there be light." And then there was light. So, what is speech? Well, speech is intelligible communication. In other words, the difference between speech and just making noises is the intelligibility of it. So, you have intelligible speech, and that gives rise to the intelligibility of the created order. And so, in the culture in which science first arose, the widespread belief was that the universe is intelligible, or to put it in more theoretical or theological terms, that God is the author of the book of nature. And therefore, we can discover in this book of nature the thoughts of God, that this book is a reasonable, intelligible, orderly thing. And the goal of science is to uncover that reasonability, that intelligibility. So again, I think it's a huge mistake to kind of pit science against faith in God. I think these things really do go together, and they go together certainly historically. If you think about many of the most prominent uh, scientists in history, you think about people like Newton, people like Copernicus. I mean, these were people of faith. In fact, Isaac Newton wrote almost as much biblical commentary as he did works in science proper. So, people aren't aware of this, but Newton certainly didn't see any contradiction at all between faith and reason or between faith and science and saw these really as mutually implicative. And so I think that's really the right way to think about it. And in a way, even contemporary scientists presuppose something that I'm not sure they really have a right to presuppose, and that would be that the universe is orderly and intelligible. And they just presuppose this in doing their work that and they seek to uncover this intelligibility. But that presupposition is one that first arose among people of faith.
So we're going to take a break in a minute. I want to just say thank you to one of our sponsors, Catholic Mass Times app, the Orange Icon app. Please go to CatholicMassTimes.com if you're interested or you're looking for Catholic churches, places to make visits, find confession, go to Mass when you're traveling. We'll be back in a minute after the break.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
So we were talking a little bit about how science presupposes the existence of God and the existence of immaterial realities, right, such as mathematics. One of the other arguments that you address is the argument of causality that Aquinas uses to show that there must be a cause, a first cause, a primary cause, an unmoved mover as used. And one of the examples you give that I really thought was helpful is you were talking about the causality of the atmosphere, atmospheric pressure, and how it's causing right now us to be sustained in life. So, how is this image of the present causality of atmospheric pressure, right? Talk to us a little bit about that, and also how that is kind of a better image for thinking about the causality of God.
Yeah, so there's two different senses of causality that Aquinas talks about, and we can illustrate those by means of this sort of water here. So I'm holding a little flask, it has some water in it, and you can think about what caused this water, and you can trace it back like, well, it came through the pipe, and the pipe came from a water company, and the water company gathered it from a lake, and the lake was caused by rainfall, and the rainfall was caused by clouds, and you can trace it back like that. And likewise with us. So, what caused me? What caused you? Well, I was caused by my biological mother and biological father. And say my biological father was caused by his own biological mother and father. And you can trace it back like that. And that's what Aquinas calls per accidens causality. And that's a real form of causality. Obviously, if our parents had never met, you and I wouldn't be here. For us to exist, our parents had to come together. Now, the the key thing about this form of causality is, your grandparents or great grandparents or parents can die and you continue to exist. Or to use the water example, the water company can go out of existence and, it just doesn't exist anymore. And yet the water can continue to exist. By contrast, there's also what Aquinas calls per se causality. And per se causality is the kind of causality that is required to continue to exist for the effect to continue to exist. So an example of that would be with this water. So I have the water in the flask, and the water is being caused right now to continue to exist in its location by the flask. And the flask, in turn, is being caused to exist right now by my hand. And my hand is being caused to exist where it is by the chair and by the floor that the chair is resting on. So if the floor that my chair is resting on just disappeared, if it was a trapdoor floor and it just went away, well, obviously the chair is not going to sit there. It's going to fall, and my hand is going to fall down with the rest of my body, and the flask is going to fall, and the water is going to fall. So, in other words, the water is getting caused to be where it is right now by the floor. There has to be some sort of foundation. In a similar way, you and I are getting caused to continue to exist right now by a wide variety of things. So, yes, in the per accidens order of causality, our parents and grandparents and great grandparents caused us. But what I mean is, right now, you and I are getting caused to continue to exist. Now, what causes you and I right now to continue to exist? Well, one of those things is atmospheric pressure. So, if you were to be put at the bottom of the ocean right now, you would immediately die. And I would immediately die, unless we had a submarine, right? If we're just, without a submarine, unpressurized, right at the bottom, we would get crushed. Likewise, if we were put out into outer space with no spacesuit, we would also die. So, what's causing us to continue to exist right now is the atmospheric pressure being within a certain range. And atmospheric pressure is also being caused to continue to exist within that range. So, what causes atmospheric pressure? Well, one of the things is temperature. So, if you radically change the temperature, you would also radically change the atmospheric pressure. So, for instance, if the temperature were suddenly to be like the surface of the sun, well, of course, we would cease to exist. If the atmospheric pressure were to be the opposite extreme of extreme cold, likewise, we would cease to exist. So, part of what's causing us to continue is having the temperature within a certain range, which is causing the atmospheric pressure to be within a certain range. Now, in this per se order of causality, there has to be a first cause that is giving the power, as it were, to all these subsequent causes. So to use a different analogy, if you think about a plant hanging from a ceiling and you say, well, the plant's getting caused to exist where it is by the soil and stuff that's holding the plant. And then the whole thing is getting caused by one link of the chain, another link of the chain, another link of the chain, all the way up to the ceiling. But each link of the chain only is able to hold up the plant because it has derivative power. That is to say, the power of any given link of the chain
Yeah.
is wholly contingent on the previous link of the chain. If you got rid of the previous link of the chain, the whole plant would fall down. So, too, in terms of our continued existence, yes, there's a number of different links in the chain, as it were, that cause us to continue to exist. But because this is a per se order, and because each link of the chain only has power to cause something because it has derivative power, there has to be a first cause that does not have derivative power, but has power from itself that's causing all these derivative links to the chain. And therefore causing us to continue to exist. So one mistake I think people can make is they think about God as maybe causing the Big Bang, and then everything comes from that, and then everything more or less is now independent. And that's to think about God a little bit like a watchmaker, where you say, well, yes, there had to be some company that put together my watch, but maybe the company went out of business. Maybe the factory where the watch was made was bombed, but my watch can continue to exist without the company continuing to exist. But Aquinas' argument for God isn't like that. What he's saying is that God's existence is required now, here and now, for us to be able to exist here and now. So it's not in the per accidens order like our parents and great grandparents and so far, but it's in the per se order that God is causing right now our continued existence.
That's so well put, and I think, yeah, exactly when I try to, but I feel like the way you articulate it there is, just anyway, so it's what I've always tried to do when I was teaching, but you articulated it better, which is great. I would often try to talk about, like, if you have a line of dominoes, there had to be something to get the dominoes started, but then there's also just the very existence of the line of dominoes, the very movement of them as they're falling, that in and of itself right now is happening. Right, and so it's not just did God create the world? Yes, but is God creating the world? Yes, and therefore, this sense in which the universe is right now existing as the effect of a causal order that's operating right now, which not only then proves that God exists, but also proves then that God is actually, like, causing me to exist, and that's where I think, like, that power, it's a more effective argument, but it also opens up then, well, if that God is causing me to exist right now, then I want to get to know him, right? I wanna find this cause that is a mind, right? We've seen as a mind behind the universe, but also, as you point out, is gonna have a will, right? If a God who is eternal is causing the universe is not God, so therefore God had to choose to create the universe. Right? The universe is something that God chose to be, so it's something that God is causing right now actively. There's a line from Aquinas in question 14, Article 8 on the intellect of God, but he says that everything that God actually brings into existence, he has a knowledge of approbation or a knowledge of approval. And so again, so this argument for God's existence is also an argument, ironically, for my own existence as a created being who is being created right now on purpose. Right. And, I just love to hear one thought. Yeah. Sometimes when I'm trying to talk with students about this, it's not so much that people don't believe that God exists, is they really don't believe that creation exists. Like they believe that the world exists, but not that it's being created right now on purpose for a purpose.
I think that's right. Yeah. So you have many people who would have a kind of deistic view of God. And so it would be akin to God as a watchmaker, that God, yes, okay, there had to be a first cause of everything originally, but more or less God is detached from the ongoing processes. Just like, again, your phone or your watch is detached from the ongoing processes of the company that made it, right? My watch can continue to exist even if the watch company goes out of business or the factory's destroyed or whatever. But yeah, Aquinas's view is very different, right? His view would be that God is right now causing you and me to continue to be in existence. So if um so that leads to, I think, a very different conception of God, that God is much more, as it were, hands-on. God isn't sort of absent from the everyday affairs of life because God is the ongoing cause of all those things in life. And I think when we think about God's knowledge too, that opens up uh, a way of relating to God in a new way. So if we think about God's knowledge simply as a matter of God created the world and that's it, and God maybe knows the world in general terms and that's it. Well, that's a very different sense of what God can know about us and how we can relate to God than if we think of God the way Aquinas does. So he would say that God knows himself perfectly. And in knowing himself perfectly, he has to, if he's going to know himself perfectly, know everything that he creates. And for reasons I just talked about, part of what God creates is you and me, right? We're part of creation. And so God knows you and I perfectly. He knows us inside and out. In fact, he knows us better than we know ourselves. And so this understanding of who God is, I think opens up us as human beings, if we realize that, to be able to have a deeper relationship with God. Because if this view is right, then God can relate to us in a deeper way than any human being can, even our husband or wife or best friend. No one can know us the way God knows us. And no one can have the depth of relationship with us that God can. And so I think Aquinas's theology, sometimes it can sound very metaphysical or speculative, but I think there's a real practical import to his teaching for kind of everyday life and everyday kind of spirituality.
Yeah, right. And so this really brings us up to then the second objection that Aquinas makes, which is the existence of evil. How can God exist if there's so much evil and suffering in the world? And, I think you devote several chapters to this question. Can evil be a means to the good? Right. And I think in some ways, really, if you see this world in a deistic lens that God just started it and now it's happening, then it seems it's going to seem unfair. Nothing good can really come out of it. The watch just continues to break. The universe just
Yeah.
continues to break. Evil continues to happen. But if you have the idea that God is intimately present and holding us and being right now and bringing us in a certain sense to a kind of perfection, again, that we were created on purpose for a purpose, restored to that purpose through Jesus Christ, which happened on purpose, as Paul says in Acts 2, right? That this happened according to the plan and foreknowledge of God. That actually changes the way we see suffering, right? And so, you give a couple examples here: the story of the Chinese farmer. You talk about the Serenity Prayer. And this idea that we don't quite know what is necessarily good or evil. We know what suffering is. But could you talk a little bit about maybe first this idea that we maybe jump to conclusions about what is good is evil too quickly?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then we'll talk a little bit about how God actually, brings about our salvation through suffering.
Yeah, so the story of the Chinese farmer, I think, is an interesting one, maybe people know it, maybe they don't, but just to review it in case you don't, the story of the Chinese farmer goes like this: Once upon a time, there was this Chinese farmer that had just one son, and the one son was responsible for making sure that the horse remained within the pen. And one day, the son just absentmindedly left the door open, and the horse escaped. And all the villagers come over to talk to the farmer, and they say, "Oh, this is a terrible tragedy. And the one horse that you had to work your farm is gone now, and this is a disaster. You and your son are going to be destitute. What a terrible tragedy this is." And the Chinese farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." Well, the next day, the horse that escaped came back, and it brought along with it six other wild horses. And the son was very on the spot at this point, and he closed the door behind the seven horses that are there. And all the villagers run in and to the farmer and say, "Oh, this is fantastic. Well, now you've got seven horses, and you're going to be able to sell some of them. You're going to be able to do the farming much better. This is an absolute triumph. This is wonderful. We should celebrate. This is so great." And the Chinese farmer said, is it a great triumph? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Now, the next day, the farmer's son is out there uh, breaking in one of the wild horses, and the son gets thrown from the horse. He breaks his leg. Oh, the villagers come over to the farmer and say, "Oh, what a tragedy. This is awful. Now your son has got a broken leg. He's not going to be able to help you anymore. This is a total catastrophe." Farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." The very next day, in comes the commander of the imperial armies, and he's gathering all able-bodied young men to fight in this upcoming battle. It's going to be a terrible battle against a huge foe, and he tells the young men, "You better be prepared to die because the forces you're going to face are overwhelming." But of course, the farmer's son couldn't go since he had a broken leg. The villagers come around again. "Oh, this is so great. Your son's going to be saved from almost certain death. And this is wonderful. What a triumph this is." And the farmer, of course, answers, as he usually does, maybe yes, maybe no. So, what is the point of the story? Well, the point is something that I think can be illustrated in most of our lives. I imagine almost all of us, if we think back on our life, can think about something that happened to us that at the time we thought was a total catastrophe. A job we didn't get or a job we lost, family tragedy, some terrible thing happened to someone in the family, some terrible thing. And at the time, we thought, this is a disaster. This is the worst thing ever. But very often later, we come to see, that was hard. That was a really tough situation. But now, I do think that that was for the best. Now I can appreciate and I can see that that helped me to grow in ways I would have never grown. And so I think that the story of the Chinese farmer, in a way, is replicated in most of our lives. And ultimately, if we think about what's the whole point of our life, well, the whole point of our life is to get to heaven. The whole point of our life ultimately is to become a saint. And so the only real tragedy is not to become a saint. And so, despite the ups and downs of our life, at the end of our life, if we do achieve our ultimate goal, if we do get to heaven, then the ups and downs of our life can be seen in a new light. That despite the tragedy and the suffering and the real difficulty, and there's no two ways to deny it. You know, to break your leg is not fun. It really hurts. And people have gone through, obviously, much worse suffering than just breaking a leg. In fact, there's things in my life I've gone through I would have much rather have broken my leg than had gone through, some of the things I've gone through. So, but I think at the end, if all this does contribute to the ultimate good of ourselves and those we love, then we can look back and say that this was definitely worthwhile.
Right. Um, and I think that does open our perspective, right? I think sometimes people think that we approach the world thinking that, okay, this is like everything should work here. No one should get sick. No one should fight. Right? That we kind of bring a like this almost hangover from Christianity, that we have heard about heaven, so we start expecting heaven on earth, and then we get really mad that heaven isn't happening. It's also just sometimes like, having a 3-year-old having a tantrum, right? Or a 30-year-old having a tantrum because they don't get what we want. And in many ways, the world just is the sort of place where we don't get what we want. And so that's just the starting point of any sober reflection on what does it mean to be human. And then we can begin to see, oh, wait a second, our preference for pleasure over pain, for good over is not as obvious as it thinks, because sometimes the pain actually leads to deeper pleasure over time. And the battle between good and evil we recognize is actually, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, right, runs through each human soul. And so, wait a second, I'm not wholly good, right? So they're like, this is complex, right? If I were in charge of of the world, it would. I mean, if I were just in charge of Ave Maria, it wouldn't be run well. Not as well as it ought to be. If I were in charge of my own life, it wouldn't be actually run well, let alone trying to run, the United States or something. So I think that there is kind of like just we have to step back and realize that we're not God. We're really not God, and therefore we have to have a kind of humility before these questions of good and evil. And I love you quote a little bit. One, you quote Father Paul Mankowski in this chapter on right why is there evil. Um, he said, "I've never met anyone who thought that God gave them the right cross to bear, including myself. Everyone looks around and says with a wistful envy at others and says to himself, now that is the kind of cross I could carry with equanimity, courage, and even joy. But of course, what makes a cross is that it kills the one who carries it. It puts to death that part of the disciple that God knows must die for salvation to work." I just think that's such a beautiful image. And you also quote on page 124, Father Walter Ciszek, who was anyway, of just a famous, just a wonderful priest who survived the Soviet, imprisonment for many years. The greatest grace God can give someone is to send him a trial he cannot bear with his own powers, right? So in a way, for us really to have a cross in our life, it has to kill us. Like when we have a trial that we actually can't carry on our own, when our lives really become unmanageable, it's when we're almost kind of ready for the first time to kind of turn over to another manager, right? He says, and then sustain him with his grace so he may endure to the end and be saved, right? Could you talk a little bit about this aspect of the role of not just suffering in general, but the cross of Jesus Christ and how it intersects in our lives and is really our way in this life and through death unto the next life?
Yeah, I think that the Gospels themselves are really a helpful way to think about the role of suffering. So, uh, when we look at the lives of both Jesus and Mary, we see all kinds of very serious suffering. So let's think for a moment about Mary. It starts at the very beginning, right at the Annunciation. I mean, she is going to become the mother of God, and then she has to break the news to Joseph, and she must have been very nervous and scared to say to him, "Hey, well, I'm pregnant, but trust me, I haven't been unfaithful. And I mean, that obviously must have been a conversation she was not looking forward to. And then, they have to uh, go to Bethlehem and they can't find a place to stay. So she has to give birth in a stable. Again, if I told my wife, hey, honey, sorry, the hospital's full. We're going to be in a stable here. This is not going to go over very well with my wife. Maybe your wife would be happy about that, but
Hardly.
I don't think anyone would. I mean, who wants to do that? And then they have to escape to Egypt. And I mean, just on and on and on and on. And the fact is that she suffered all kinds of things, and then at the end, obviously suffered terribly, terribly. I can think of almost nothing worse for a mother or a father, for that matter, than to see your own child suffering in a torturous sort of way, getting mocked, and then dying. I mean, this is just catastrophic suffering. And then, of course, Jesus of Nazareth went through everything he went through. And so, one thing that I think about when I think about those stories is it's sort of odd in a way that suffering is seen as this knockdown blow to Christianity, where in the very foundational story of Christianity, the principal characters suffer like crazy. And so it's like, well, how is this sort of a knockdown blow? And then how can I expect to live a suffering free life? When I think that the immaculately conceived Mother of God and the second person, Jesus of the Holy Trinity, went through all these just terrible, terrible sufferings. And I think, well, but I don't deserve any suffering. I should have a perfect life and everything should go just as I want. And having things go as you want, that also in a way is, I think, the wrong way to think about it. Part of growth is educating your desires. And so all of us from the very earliest of ages have to grow and have our desires formed and have our desires changed. If we were to remain as we were when we were 2 years old, and I want what I want, and imagine we got what we wanted all the time, and you just gave a 2-year-old always whatever the 2-year-old wanted. Well, what would that child look like when the child was, 17? I'm guessing that child's gonna be a complete brat, and it'd be just awful. And if you continue just to get indulged and get everything you wanted all the time and didn't have your desires formed and shaped, sometimes by suffering, again, where would that lead you? Well, I think we know where it would lead us. Think about people, for instance, Hollywood celebrities. So they don't always get what they want, but they, more than most of us, can get more of the time what they want. And what happens to them? Are they really actually fulfilled and happy? I think the results of that are obvious, right? They tend to have lives when they indulge just getting whatever they want that go completely off the cliff. So I do think that part of the Christian story and part really of just development is an education of our desire, a shaping of our desire, so that over time, hopefully, we grow. And what we desire maybe 10 years from now is not what we currently desire, that our desires change and shift. So I think it's a huge mistake to think of our desires just as set and given, that we want what we want and that's it, period, and the end of the story. I think that's a kind of atomization, a kind of snapshot view. And I think the deeper view and the more truthful view is not just take a snapshot. Am I getting what I want right here and right now? And if I don't, I'm suffering and I'm having a temper tantrum. But to think about it in terms of an overall growth of life, and ultimately to think about it in terms of eternal life. So if we go back to Jesus and Mary, yes, they suffered terribly, but now she is the queen of heaven, and he is now at the right hand of the Father. So at the end of the story, the suffering ends up being worthwhile, and that's what we hope for too. We hope at the end of our story, yes, there's crosses, and we don't suffer exactly the way Mary or Jesus suffered, and I don't suffer the exact same way you suffer, and you don't suffer the exact same way I suffer. We all have our individual cross and our individual portion of suffering, but at the end, hopefully, we'll share in the glory that's enjoyed now by both Mary and Jesus.
Yeah, that's, just so beautifully put, and it reminds me a little bit of, Ephesians chapter 4, 22 and following where, Paul says basically, "Put off the old nature, put off the old man, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and put on the new nature, the new man created after the likeness of God, in true righteousness and holiness, right? And part of the problem is that we have deceitful, confused, counterfeit desires that actually lead us to try to find happiness on earth. And that is right. Those desires are deceitful and they need to die. Right. And really, they can only be renewed by the spirit of our minds, which is really the gift of the Holy Spirit, right? That is that spirit of Jesus Christ. And that sense that this beautiful mystery that all of our suffering is uniquely ours. And yet in Christ, through our baptism, right, through the Eucharistic, also somehow becomes uniquely his, right? We can share it with him and see that idea that our goal, what is our desire, is to have our wills truly desire God, and in some sense, right, to kind of admit that we can't do that on our own, but to admit that we want to let God do it in us, and let God do it in us in Jesus Christ. So we're coming up to the end of our time. I wanted to thank you so much for being on the show today. Professor Kaczor, Christopher Kaczor who's a professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University and is also honorary professor of the Renewal of Catholic Life at the Word on Fire Institute, also president of the American Association of Catholic, or the American Catholic Philosophical Association. And this new book is Believable Reasoning About God from Plato and Aristotle to C.S. Lewis and Jordan Peterson with Ave Maria Press. Thanks so much for being on the show today. Christopher, so glad you're here.
Thank you, Michael. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and I look forward to talking with you again, I hope at some point.
That's right. And just so if people are interested, I have an earlier podcast with Dr. Kaczor on Jordan Peterson, the Bible, and the search for meaning, episode 139. And for people who are interested in topics from today, there's also an episode on defending the faith today with C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity with Dr. Andrew Swafford, episode 169. And also with one of our professors of philosophy at Ave Maria University, Dr. Joseph Trabick, Can We Prove God Exists, episode 55. So thanks again for being with us and for watching or listening to the show today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.